As mentioned, I'll be talking about learning about birds through citizen science. Birds are really beautiful and they're all around us. They show an amazing diversity. All of you would know birds for their color and for the beauty they bring around you. So birds have, through generations, inspired stories, artwork, paintings, songs, music. It continues to inspire music even today. There are various paintings that have Indian peafowl. There are, so on the left is a northern goshawk, on the right is the Himalayan monal, an incredibly beautiful bird. So they're part of our stamps, part of our culture. And therefore, bird watching has become a really popular hobby, not just in India, but everywhere in the world. So the latest statistics are that I think 1 out of every 20 people in 20 adults in the United Kingdom, for example, are bird watchers. And I think it's somewhat similar in USA and some other places where this culture has been there for a longer while. So it's a really popular hobby, and in India, it's growing tremendously at the moment. So what do we do as bird watchers in India? So I'm a bird watcher, of course, which is why I'm talking to you about this. But there are a lot of people I know, including many people who went to IIM in the past, who are now dedicated bird watchers. So what do we do when we watch birds? We, of course, watch them. We have binoculars. Sometimes we get fascinated by the photographs we can take. So we do all sorts of things trying to get photos, uh, and we take notes so that sometimes we sketch the bird in a notebook, we write down what we see, and this is what we used to do in the past. So there are many old bird watchers who have notebooks and notebooks and notebooks of past observations, but which are all lying in their trunk at the moment, never to be of any greater purpose. So how do we aggregate this private knowledge? So we all watch birds, but what is our ultimate objective is to be able to conserve the birds around us, learn more about them, and eventually have a world where humans are able to coexist with nature in some way. So how do we use all this knowledge that we gain through this really enjoyable hobby for some sort of greater good? So Bird Count India, the group that I work with, that's one of our primary objectives. We promote bird watching in the country, and we encourage bird watchers to participate and contribute something more. And I'll explain how that's done. So this is citizen science, and we see citizen science being harnessed in various disciplines, not just with nature, not just with birds, but with anything from astronomy to various other disciplines. What I have here on the screen is an app called eBird, and this is where technology plays such an important role in bridging this gap. So the moment there is a way to upload this information onto a public platform, people tend to do it. So this is a tool called eBird. There are other tools to contribute information about nature. There's something called iNaturalist, which is fantastic, and all of you should check out these two apps. But I'll focus on birds and eBird for this talk. So this is what a checklist on eBird looks like. What I would previously note down in my notebook, as I saw two of this species, one of this other bird, etc., etc. Purple sunbird at the bottom, I've written is singing. So this is information which now I can enter through the app and upload onto an aggregated database. So this is what my eBird looks like. So I have uploaded so far 3,800 checklists over the last many years, seen about 1,000 species in India, and so on. Uploaded so many photographs, etc. So what happens when thousands of people upload information like this? We get an incredible database. So we have, so this is what you see here is are the point locations of all checklists that have been uploaded onto eBird by birdwatchers in India. It's remarkable where all birdwatchers have been. And if you feel this takes the shape of the country, it's purely incidental because there's no political boundary drawn here. These are all just observations from India, and it's actually just the points from every corner of the country that's giving this impression. So there are over 20 million observations now and 1 million checklists. So what you saw on the screen earlier was a checklist. There are 9 observations. It was a checklist, and over 20,000 bird watchers in India who have been a part of this. Of course, there are many more. There are over a lakh, certainly, but slowly more and more people start participating in these initiatives. And every single species ever reported in the country is now in this database. What people also do is they upload photographs with this, photographs and audio, and that again forms a really nice database where which allows you to ask many questions in return. So this is for the world, not just for India. This is called the Macaulay Library, which ties in with eBird, and there are over 25 million photographs uploaded here. These are all from the checklist. Almost a million audio files of birds making sounds. So it has immense potential to do something more. So all of these observations, of course, you might think that people can upload anything they want, which is true. So you need some sort of data quality check for this to be scientifically valuable. So there are these regional filters. For example, Bangalore alone has its own filter. So if any bird that is very unusual in Bangalore is reported, it will be flagged. And then there are over 200 data quality editors who then take a look at that, look at those flagged observations, and then contact the observer and have a back and forth and try and get evidence so that this information becomes valuable in the future. So how has this database advanced our knowledge? So remember that this people started uploading information only in 2014. So this is effectively a 7-year-old data set which has grown exponentially. So there are four immediate takeaways. You learn more about bird distributions, where they are found. You learn about migration, which is one of the most fascinating phenomena, at least in my opinion. You learn about population trends, which is vital for conservation, something that was not possible before that. You learn about which birds to prioritize, which habitats to prioritize for conservation, and if we really want sustainable nature around us, what to focus on. And then there's learning from photos, which I'll get to at the end. So starting off with distributions, have I suppose some of you have seen field guides, bird field guides. Some of you may have. Those field guides have distribution maps, which are really important. So now if you look at this distribution map, these are two very good and popular field guides for birds. One is by Grimmett Inskip and the other one is by Rasmussen. Um, what you do is, now say you see a bird that looks black and white with a long beak like this, you look at the field guide, and then say you're in the northern parts of Jammu and Kashmir, you see this and say, okay, it cannot be this bird, it cannot be a black-headed ibis because it's not found in that area. The distribution maps say that it's not found there. So these distribution maps are really important to learn more about the bird, also in terms of both for bird watchers and in terms of how the species is expanding or contracting range. So it's important to be able to follow these distributions. But if you notice something in these distribution maps, you'll see that uh, entire regions like parts of Madhya Pradesh, Chhattisgarh, etc., are supposed to not have the species. Even parts of Orissa, parts of Andhra, etc. So this comes from expert knowledge with 3 or 4 people actually contributing information. But in eBird, you see that this species is actually found across the peninsula. It's just that there was no information from these regions in the past. So what happens when so many people from different corners of the country contribute information is that our understanding of these distributions becomes far more clarified than it earlier was. Then you can have more fancy modeling like species distribution models, which come from correlating information between various climatic variables and the presence or absence of a bird species. So this is a tiny bird called the Blythe's reed warbler. And if any of you remember that checklist which I just shared earlier, which was made today afternoon behind my house in Bangalore, this bird was there. So this is incredible. It's a tiny brown bird that comes all the way from Sweden and Finland and inhabitable parts of Russia. And the entire population of the bird winters in the Indian subcontinent, spends the winter here. And unlike many other birds which are found in dense forests, etc., this one loves gardens, parks, our backyards. It makes a chuck sound, chuck chuck it does. So this bird called Blythe's reed warbler, we understand where it breeds, where it passes through while migrating down, and what the wintering area is. This is for another bird that spends the summer in the Himalayas. It breeds in the Himalayas, but comes down to Western Ghats, and Nandi Hills in Bangalore is a great place to see them. Also, Valley School near your place. So this is again it's a really pretty blue and orange and white bird that where we understand finer details about its summer range and its winter range through this information. Then migration. Migration is about movement. Migration can be shown by many organisms, not just birds. Uh, Many mammals are known to migrate. You must have heard of the famous African migrations of wildebeest and other animals. Dragonflies, butterflies migrate, but birds are the best known organisms to migrate, and they migrate for various reasons. They migrate to get to more favorable climatic conditions. They migrate where there is greater food availability. This is again entirely from eBird data alone. Just by following observations of people through time, you get an understanding of where the bird is moving, where it is during different parts of the year. And this Amur falcon is an iconic species. There are spectacular congregations of this bird in parts of Nagaland. You must have heard. It's quite a famous success story in conservation, where previously a lot of these birds used to be hunted, but then now people locally are conserving them. Where there are millions of birds at a single site uh, during October, November, and parts of December. So this bird breeds in the Amur region of China and Russia. It passes through India. It doesn't spend the winter in India. It passes through India, parts of Northeast India, on its way to South Africa, which is quite remarkable. It just cuts across Asia and Africa and goes to one part of Africa. Bar-headed goose, a bird that in India you can see in parts of Ladakh in the summer, but otherwise it breeds in many parts of the Tibetan Plateau and in China. But the entire global population of this bird comes to India during winter. So in a sense, we are custodians of the species during winter. And there's something that is very difficult to know until this sort of information turns up. You cannot be in every place at the same time as a scientist. You have to depend upon bird watchers in such a case. Red-breasted and tiger flycatcher, two really pretty small birds that come to India from really far. They converge from two opposite sides of the globe, and most of their global populations funnel into the Indian subcontinent during winter. Indian blue robin, the species which I spoke of earlier, I showed the distribution map. You see them all coming down to the south, to the Western Ghats in Sri Lanka. And in the summer, they go back to the Himalayas. Right? If anybody has any questions, just type it in chat and I'll see if I can look at them. The next thing that you can learn from this are population trends, which I mentioned was very important for conservation in general. So in India, unlike some parts of the world where there are many volunteer bird watchers, they can have volunteer-driven censuses of birds or surveys, breeding bird surveys. That's something that is not possible at an India-wide scale at the moment. So, and therefore, India has never actually had a status assessment of its birds until last year. So, if somebody was to ask, okay, which bird is really threatened in India, you can say, okay, maybe these one or two well-known species like Great Indian Bustard. But what about our common birds? How is common myna? How is the crows doing? Are crows reducing or increasing? What is going on? Nobody knew. So this is a gap which this data set allowed us to fill. And that is because you can calculate something called a reporting frequency from these eBird checklists. So say there are multiple checklists. Every day I make a checklist from home and I mention these birds. So say this year I make 100 checklists and maybe 80% of them have this Blythe-Reed warbler, that bird which I mentioned, or 60% has, right? Like species B over here. Species B over here is found in, was recorded in 3 out of 5 checklists. So it has a reporting frequency of 60%. Now this reporting frequency can be tracked over time. Say 2 or 3 years from now, if I'm making these 100 checklists a year, I see that Blythe-Reed warbler is now only there in 20 checklists. So then that's a matter of concern. So that's an early warning sign, and we can try and figure out why. What has happened to this bird? Why is it seen so much less than it used to be? So this gives us an idea of where to prioritize conservation. But of course, a database like eBird, which is where you have bird watchers who are both learning how to watch birds and experts contributing information of various forms. It's a what's called a semi-structured data set. It's not completely structured, because you have the option of watching birds for 2 hours. You have the option watching birds over many kilometers. There are various possibilities. So you need some way to be able to account for all of the biases in the data. And I'm talking to you about all of this because I suppose you're interested in data as much as the birds. So what you'd want to do is you'd want to find some way to standardize for effort. Effort is time, duration, anything that captures the amount of effort you're putting into bird watching. Then you have changes over time, over season. So you have some birds, although they're there in your house, they make more sounds during the breeding season. So they might be more likely to be seen during a particular time of the year. So you'd want some way to be able to standardize for that, because different parts of the country, different years might have different amounts of effort in these different months, if that was clear. So you want a way to standardize for that. And then you want to find a way to standardize for space. So if you want to find out the status of a bird in a huge country like India, you want to be able to standardize to account for these biases that places like Bangalore, etc. have. So Bangalore, of course, has many more bird watchers than Chikbalapur or even Kanakpura or any of these places that are surrounding the thing. But you don't want this. You don't want the status of birds of the country to be the status of birds in Bangalore, right? So you want to find some way to average across space. So what we use are these generalized linear mixed effects models to be able to standardize for all of these biases and arrive at trends over time. So you see, what I'm going to show you now are changes in this reporting frequency, percentage changes in the reporting frequency from before 2000 till today. And we'll start off with a very well-liked bird, a house sparrow. So of course I can't ask you to raise your hand, so maybe I can. What do you think has happened to house sparrow? And I suppose all of you are really good with Zoom, so you might be able to. There's a raise hands option. What do you think has happened to house sparrow? If you think it has declined, raise your hands. Okay, so that's quite a few people raising your hands. Nice. Okay. Um, so there have been reasons. This house sparrow has been in the news, it's been in the media, but remember that this was not a data-driven assessment of sparrows. There were various perceptions going around, and there were various theories like mobile towers were causing their decline, radiation. There's even one Rajnikant movie about it. I think it was called 2.0 or something. I haven't seen it myself, but I've heard that it actually has sparrows, which is actually it's nice, but the message that's propagated is incorrect. So there's actually no evidence that the mobile towers or any of these other theories floating around have actually affected sparrows. And if you look at what the data says, house sparrows actually have remained remarkably stable over time. They have only disappeared from the cities, and I'll get to that later. And so that's the perception. The perception is driven from the cities. So house sparrows have indeed declined in Bangalore, in Delhi, in Kolkata, in Bombay. But if you look at the country as a whole, house sparrows are doing extremely well. They're thriving in the villages. 99% of the country, they're doing extremely well. So this is how a data-driven assessment really helps. Another species called the redneck falcon. This one has crashed almost. It's across the country. Its population is, or at least its abundance or reporting frequency is declined by about 60 or 70% in the last 25 years. Ashiprinia, a really common garden bird in Bangalore, is a species that actually likes degradation. The moment you cut down a few trees and some bushes come up, the Ashiprinia will move in there. But if you have a tree, it won't be there. So Ashiprinia naturally has done extremely well because we have a very degraded urban environment. So it loves it, and it's increased by almost 100% during this period. And I mentioned house sparrows. So you see, this is a comparison of house sparrows across the country and house sparrows in the big cities alone. And you see that it's declined by 30 or 40% in the big cities, which has driven the narrative. Now, why have they declined in big cities? Not because of mobile towers, not because of any such reason, simply because they don't have enough food and safe nesting places. So the moment you provide nesting places in the city is something I encourage all of you to do. You have these nest boxes, house sparrows can start moving in again. Of course, they need food as well, but if you have a garden or something, they manage. A very famous and sad case, the decline of vultures, because of veterinary drug called diclofenac. I suppose again many of you have heard of this, but this happened in the late 90s, early 2000s, where suddenly vultures used to be like crows in India once upon a time. And I remember this from my childhood. You'd have vultures sitting on random trees in the cities. Suddenly in the late 90s, they started dropping like they just started dropping dead. And it took a few years for people to find out why that was happening, or even that something big was happening. And it was because of this drug. And so when livestock, cattle, etc., were treated with diclofenac and the vultures ate them, it would cause kidney failure and the vultures would die. So this, for some species, as you see over here with white-rumped vulture and Indian vulture, this caused a decline of over 99%. So practically the entire country's populations were wiped out through that period. And this is again something that can happen to any common species. So this sort of regular monitoring is extremely important. It could happen to a crow or a myna or any other species that is extremely abundant today, and you don't know what chemical or what intervention can actually cause these populations to completely die off. The top one is Egyptian vulture, which hasn't seen such a big decline, but is declining nevertheless. Another interesting case are Arctic migrants. So you see the top two trend lines. Those are for resident shorebirds. Shorebirds are these birds called waders that walk in shallow water. They eat insects in shallow water. And there are some that are from India and nearby. There are some that migrate from immediate temperate areas like China, the Tibetan Plateau, etc. And there are some that migrate all the way from the Arctic, including Bartail Godwit. You must have heard it. Covers, I think, 17,000 kilometers in a single flight while migrating down from the Arctic to Australia. So there are these Arctic shorebirds. So now Arctic shorebirds, what you see in this graph, are Arctic shorebirds have declined far more than other similar species. Why is that? So there is a mechanism that is well known now. So what's happening in the Arctic is that because of climate change, the Arctic region is affected far more than other areas because you have ice melt, which plays an extremely important role over there. So what's been happening is that previously birds would go at a particular time of the year. They would migrate there to breed, and then they would go and lay their eggs. The eggs hatch, chicks come out. When the chicks come out, the ice is melted and there is peak insect availability. So the chicks can grow up to be strong individuals that can then make this long flight again of thousands of kilometers back to the tropics. But with climate change, what's happened? This entire period has shifted a little bit. And you see this even in Bangalore. We're getting hotter and hotter Februaries. It's a pretty bad February at the moment in Bangalore. And I think it's the warmest for quite a while. And it's not random. It's that we are having this winters reduce in duration and summers increase. So what happens is the birds don't know that. I mean, they're not able to adapt as fast. So they go at the same time. They reach in maybe March or April. They go up to the Arctic, but the ice is already melted. But they still lay their eggs. The chicks come out, but the insects have already come out before that because insects start coming out the moment the ice melts, moment the temperature is favorable, as you see in Bangalore now. We're already seeing an increase in mosquitoes, which would otherwise be a couple of months later. So you have this, the chicks come out, the chicks don't have many insects to eat, and then they grow up to be weak, small birds that then cannot make that big migratory journey. So all of what I spoke about, all of these trends, all of this was published as part of the State of India's Birds report last year in the Convention for Migratory Species COP in Gandhinagar last year in February, just before COVID hit, or potentially after COVID hit, but that event still happened. So this was released then. And this was actually a collaborative initiative by a number of institutions that saw the opportunity in this data set, including the Bombay Natural History Society, Nature Conservation Foundation, Wildlife Institute of India, etc. Many organizations that work with wildlife got together, took this data set and decided to find out what the status of birds were. So you see that about 101 species now have been categorized as of high conservation concern, and 58 species have declined, have undergone a strong decline in the long term, and 72 species have currently undergoing a strong decline. So this hopefully is going to, so because the government was involved in some way, hopefully it will be taken up, and there will be some decisions that are informed by these priorities that have been set now. And then the last part, I've spoken about three ways in which the information has been used and will continue to be used. There are amazing insights that you can get from this immense photo library that has been built now. One thing that can be done is to discover new phenomena. Have any of you seen a paradise flycatcher? No? Anyone? You can raise your hands. So it's this remarkably beautiful bird. It has a long tail. You see this one. Oh, there is a hand raised. Fantastic. And look around in the IMD campus; they'll still be around. Look for these amazing birds with long tails. They can be white or they can be rufous. So these two are both are males, and nobody knew what this meant. Why are they there in two colors? Why are the males there in two colors? Why are they white and rufous at the same time? What is going on? Is it that there is some something that is determining a ratio of rufous birds to white birds, or is there some sort of geographic separation? Nobody knew. What you see in this map is that the northern populations are all migratory. They come down to the south. In parts of the south, including near Bangalore, they are present year round. So there is some movement. So does that have anything to do with these colors? So by analyzing all the photos that are available now in this library, what some researchers found is that look at the top left graph. During the breeding season in summer, you see that in Sri Lanka and in South India, almost all the birds are rufous. Whereas in the Himalayas and in North India, further north, almost all the birds are white, all the breeding birds. And if you look in winter, everything gets homogenized. So what's happening is that all these white birds from the north Himalayas are coming down south, and it's all getting homogenized during winter. But actually, in the summer, rufous birds are breeding in South India, and white birds are breeding in the north. So now this raises many questions. Are these different organisms actually? Are they different species? What is the evolutionary underpinning here? So there are many questions that arise from this, and something that you can only get because this data set has been built. There is perhaps even a new species that has been discovered from the dataset. This is a black-breasted weaver. There's only one place to see it in Bangalore, which is in Hoskote. Some of you may have heard of Hoskote. And this is a really pretty bird during the breeding season. It can either be black-headed or it can be white-headed. But then we have these WhatsApp groups for birding. And somebody on a WhatsApp group about a year back said that there is something wrong. I used to live in Bombay earlier. Now I'm in Bangalore, and I can guarantee that they look completely different in Bombay, the same species. They used to have a black head there, here they have a white head. So then various people started telling what they had seen, and it appears that in any given place, people have only either seen a white head or a black head. And if you look at all the literature, they feel that there is a transition between the two, but nobody has ever seen that. So we actually look at photographs of this bird on the library. Each one has a GPS location. You see that there's a clear geographic separation of the white-headed birds and the black-headed birds. What was considered the same species actually might be completely different. And this is again emerged from citizen science. And perhaps something that will interest you the most. Previously, to identify birds, we had a few ways. There were field guides. You look at the bird and you see, okay, does it look something similar to that? You look with binoculars, and sometimes you can't make out. Otherwise, you take a photo and you put it on Facebook or send it on WhatsApp to somebody and try and get somebody else to tell you what it is. But now what you can do is this Macaulay library has has so many images that you can actually train an AI software to be able to identify birds. So there's something called Merlin, again produced by the Cornell Lab, the same group that manages eBird. And in Merlin, you can put these photos in. So this is this bird was again there in the checklist. This is the one that is increased by 100%. It's Ashiprinia. So if you put it in Merlin, you can either specify a location or a date or not, and then it's going to tell you based because it's been trained on this large data set and it continues to be trained on more images. It's going to tell you which species it is. So check out Merlin. It also has other fantastic information about birds, and of course, all of these resources are free. So just check them out, and you can do various other things with Merlin. But uh, the AI capability is fantastic, and you have two brown birds that look similar, completely identical to the human eye, and the algorithm will pick it out. So check it out. So, of course, all of this, all of you can be involved in this. You can be involved in many ways. You can be involved in just watching birds, in contributing this information. You can be involved by keeping yourself aware of any advances in knowledge of birds or what's happening in bird watching or in the bird world, as they say. There are many bird walks that happen around the city. You can always go for them. They'll be really enjoyable, I can guarantee it. And there is now something called the Flock. It's a newsletter about birds, and you can subscribe to it, and you'll get updates about birds straight in your inbox. I don't know how many of you subscribe to newsletters, but it's an easy way to get this information. And check out the Bird Count India website. It's birdcount.in, and we regularly update articles about both bird identification and about where these walks are happening, where these regular events are happening around the city. And if you do want to participate in any of those, you'll have direct links there, or you can get in touch with me or anybody else, any other contact, and participate in any of these. So that's it. Gave you an overview of what bird-related citizen science is about and what's been possible, and want to keep some time for questions. So I hope you have a lot of questions. So let me know.